Picture a massive chain, forged link by heavy link, stretched taut across a narrow stretch of water. On one end, a formidable fortress, its walls bristling with soldiers. On the other, the fate of an empire. For centuries, this chain was the ultimate symbol of security, a physical and psychological barrier that convinced an entire civilization they were safe from the sea. But what happens when that chain is broken, not by brute force, but by breathtaking ingenuity? What happens when the one thing you believed was unbreachable fails? The story we are about to uncover is not just about the fall of a wall or the capture of a castle. It is about how a single day, a single battle, at a place called the Fortress of the Golden Horn, sent a shockwave so powerful that it shattered the naval world order for an entire century, redirecting the flow of trade, the fate of empires, and the very course of history itself. This is a tale of how the medieval Mediterranean, a world dominated by the ancient Byzantine Empire and its legendary fleets, was turned upside down. The fortress was more than just stone and mortar. It was the linchpin, the final guardian of the sea lanes leading to the heart of the greatest city in the Christian world. Its existence allowed an aging empire to project power, to control commerce, and to stand firm against the rising tide of a new and ambitious power, the Ottoman Sultanate. The balance of power hung in a delicate equilibrium, and that equilibrium depended entirely on the strength of this one, seemingly impregnable stronghold. We will walk the ramparts of this maritime marvel, understanding why its defenders truly believed it could never be taken, but we will also witness the rise of the challenger. We will see the visionary Sultan Mehmed II, a leader who looked at the same unbreachable walls and saw not an obstacle, but an opportunity. His solution was so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that it defied all contemporary military logic. It involved dragging warships over a mountain, a feat that would catch the defenders completely by surprise and render their greatest defensive advantage utterly useless. The fall of the Fortress of the Golden Horn was the crack that brought down the entire dam. It led directly to the fall of Constantinople, ended the Roman Empire after over 1,000 years, and unleashed the Ottoman navy as the new, undisputed master of the inland sea. The consequences would stretch from the battlefields of Rhodes to the shipyards of Venice, and even push European explorers to risk everything seeking new routes to the east, ultimately accelerating the age of discovery. This is the story of how a single point of failure on a rocky shore changed the world map forever. To understand the sheer magnitude of what was lost, we must first step back into the world as it existed for centuries. Picture the Mediterranean not as a welcoming blue sea, but as a vast, liquid battlefield, a chessboard where every island and coastline was a strategic square. For over 1,000 years, one player had dominated this board, the Byzantine Empire, the direct continuation of the Roman Empire in the east. Its capital, Constantinople, was more than just a city. It was the ultimate prize, a metropolis of unimaginable wealth and culture, and its survival depended entirely on its ability to control the sea lanes leading to its gates. The Byzantine navy was the key to this control, a force made legendary by its most terrifying weapon, Greek fire. This was not ordinary fire. It was a mysterious, sticky liquid that could burn even on water, projected from tubes on their ships, creating an inferno that could devour entire enemy fleets. This technological marvel was a closely guarded state secret, a psychological weapon that instilled dread in any admiral foolish enough to challenge Byzantine waters. And guarding the most vital approach to the city, the narrow inlet known as the Golden Horn, stood the fortress of the Golden Horn itself. Think of it not just as a castle, but as the linchpin in an entire defensive system. Its position was a masterpiece of strategic geography. From its high walls, lookouts could see for miles, giving the Byzantines unparalleled warning of any approaching threat. But its real genius was the massive iron chain it controlled. This chain, supported by floating barrels, could be stretched across the entire entrance to the Golden Horn, physically sealing off the city's vulnerable northern harbor from any attacking fleet. This meant that even if an enemy armada managed to fight its way through the Bosporus, it would be stopped cold at this final barrier, trapped in a narrow channel and exposed to fire from the fortress's walls. This single defensive feature allowed a relatively small Byzantine fleet to protect the heart of the empire, enabling them to control all maritime trade passing through these straits. Every merchant ship from Venice, Genoa, or the Black Sea had to pay heavy taxes to the empire for the right to pass, filling the imperial coffers and financing this formidable defense. For generations, this system created a stable, if tense, status quo. The fortress was more than stone and iron. It was a symbol of permanence, a guarantee that the ancient order would endure. But across the board, a new and hungry player was rapidly advancing its pieces. The Ottoman Sultanate, born from a small Turkish principality in Anatolia, had been expanding its territories for over a century, slowly encircling the Byzantine Empire. They were masters of land warfare with highly disciplined infantry and powerful artillery. Yet they initially had little presence at sea. The Mediterranean was a Byzantine lake, and the fortress was the lock on the gate. This created a delicate balance of power. The Ottomans held the land, but the Byzantines, through their naval dominance anchored by the fortress, controlled the vital sea-based lifelines of supply, reinforcement, and wealth. The empire, though a shadow of its former self, could still survive as long as that chain remained unbroken and the Golden Horn remained secure. The entire political and military equilibrium of the region hinged on this one fragile point. It was a stalemate that could not last. The Ottomans understood that to achieve their ultimate goal, the conquest of Constantinople, they would have to solve the riddle of the sea. They would have to find a way to break the chain, not with brute force, but with brilliance, forever shattering the world that this fortress had been built to protect. To truly appreciate the fortress that guarded the Golden Horn, you have to think like a medieval engineer tasked with an impossible problem: how to protect a city's most vulnerable flank from the greatest navies of the age. The solution they crafted was nothing short of architectural genius. Perched on a sharp head of land, the fortress was not merely built on high ground. It was fused with the very landscape, its foundations sunk deep into the bedrock of the promontory. This gave its defenders a panoramic view of the sea approaches, ensuring that no ship could sneak up unnoticed. The first thing any approaching sailor would see was its formidable silhouette against the sky, a silent warning to turn back. But a good view was not enough. The walls themselves were a multi-layered puzzle for any attacker to solve. The outer curtain wall was thick and high, designed to absorb the impact of siege engines and blunt the force of a direct assault. Behind it stood an even taller inner wall, creating a deadly killing ground between them where invaders would be trapped and exposed to arrow fire and boiling pitch poured from the battlements above. At strategic points along these walls rose massive bastions, which are essentially giant, projecting towers. These weren't just for show, they were artillery platforms. Each bastion could house powerful torsion catapults, known as mangonels, and later massive bombards, giving the fortress the ability to strike at enemy ships long before they could even think of reaching the harbor entrance. The design ensured that every angle of approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire, making a direct naval assault a suicidal proposition. However, the crown jewel of this defensive system, the feature that made it truly unique, was the legendary chain boom. This was not a simple rope or a small chain. We are talking about a colossal iron cable, each link reportedly as thick as a man's forearm, buoyed by massive wooden floats. In times of peace, this chain lay submerged on the seabed, allowing friendly merchant traffic to pass in and out of the Golden Horn freely. But when threat loomed on the horizon, a complex system of winches and capstans, operated from within the fortress, would slowly, ominously, raise this immense barrier until it stretched taut from the fortress's base all the way across to a corresponding fortification on the opposite shore. The psychological effect of seeing this unbreakable barrier rise from the depths cannot be overstated. It was a physical declaration that the harbor was closed, transforming the protected waters of the Golden Horn into an impassable sanctuary for the Byzantine fleet and a death trap for any enemy vessel that dared to come too close. The human element within these walls was just as crucial as the stone and iron. The garrison stationed there was composed of veteran soldiers, some from elite guard units, who were exceptionally well provisioned. Deep cisterns ensured a supply of fresh water, and vast storerooms were filled with grain, salted meat, and ammunition, allowing them to withstand a prolonged siege. But perhaps their greatest weapon was their belief. For generations, they had been told and had come to believe in the absolute invincibility of their post. They were the guardians of the empire's front door, and the very reputation of the fortress served as a deterrent, often making its physical strength unnecessary. This created a powerful feedback loop. The fortress had never fallen, so it was considered unbreachable, and because it was considered unbreachable, few ever risked a serious attack. Its strength was as much a myth as it was a material reality, and that myth was a shield in itself. This perfect fusion of ideal geography, cutting-edge military architecture, and unshakable morale is what made the fortress of the Golden Horn the linchpin of an empire. Its seeming perfection is precisely what makes the story of its fall not just a tale of defeat, but a lesson in how even the most brilliant designs can be overcome by a more brilliant strategy. Yet while the Byzantines placed their faith in stone and iron, a very different kind of power was gathering strength just beyond the horizon. The Ottoman ambition was not content with land alone. It was a force that looked out across the water and saw not a barrier but a highway to destiny. At the heart of this seismic shift was a young Sultan, Mehmed II, a leader whose vision extended far beyond the battlefields of his ancestors. He understood with chilling clarity a fundamental truth: the great city of Constantinople, protected on three sides by water, could never be taken by land power alone. Its legendary walls had repelled invaders for 1,000 years. The key to the city lay not in scaling its ramparts, but in controlling the sea that was its lifeblood. To achieve the impossible, he would have to build a navy capable of challenging the masters of the Mediterranean. This was no small task. The Ottomans were historically a land power, their strength lying in their formidable cavalry and disciplined infantry. Building a fleet from scratch required more than just timber and sails. It demanded a complete reorientation of their military and industrial complex. Mehmed became the driving force behind this monumental effort. He poured the vast wealth of his expanding empire into a frantic shipbuilding program. Along the coasts of the Sea of Marmara and the Gallipoli Peninsula, The sound of hammers and saws filled the air as new shipyards sprang to life. But the Sultan's genius lay not merely in construction, but in assimilation. He actively recruited experienced sailors, shipwrights, and navigators from the very territories he had conquered: Greeks, Genoese, and Venetians, who brought with them generations of maritime knowledge. He wasn't just building Ottoman ships, he was creating a hybrid force that combined Ottoman discipline with the best seafaring techniques of the Mediterranean world. This strategic recruitment was a masterstroke. These experienced mariners knew the weaknesses of the Byzantine naval system intimately. They understood the limitations of the great galleys, the tactics for avoiding Greek fire, and most importantly, they knew that the legendary chain boom had one critical vulnerability. It was a static defense. It assumed an enemy would always approach from the sea. Mehmed and his advisors began to conceive of a new doctrine of naval warfare, one that prized mobility, artillery, and above all, strategic surprise. They were not trying to out-Byzantine the Byzantines. They were inventing a new way to fight at sea. This nascent fleet was being honed into a precise instrument designed for one specific, audacious purpose: to unlock the door that the fortress of the Golden Horn had kept shut for centuries. While the defenders looked out from their walls with confidence, a storm was being carefully engineered. A storm that would not try to break the chain, but would find a way to sail right over it. And so, the moment of truth arrived. The year was 1453, and the Ottoman noose began to tighten around Constantinople. But this was not the chaotic, frenzied charge one might expect from a besieging army. Sultan Mehmed II's strategy was one of deliberate, calculated pressure, a siege in the truest sense, designed to squeeze the life out of the city and its defenders through sheer attrition. On land, his massive army, which contemporary sources claim numbered in the hundreds of thousands, encircled the mighty Theodosian walls, digging trenches and constructing earthworks to seal off any possibility of escape or reinforcement. The great cannons, including the massive bombard built by the Hungarian engineer Orban, were slowly dragged into position, their ominous muzzles pointing toward walls that had stood unconquered for a millennium. The goal was clear: to demonstrate overwhelming force, to grind down the defenders' morale through a constant, visible threat. Simultaneously, the newly built Ottoman fleet made its presence known on the water. Dozens of galleys, biremes, and smaller craft sailed into the Bosporus, their oars dipping in unison, creating a forest of masts that stretched along the seaward walls. Their initial mission was to establish a blockade, to cut the city off from the outside world and prevent any supplies or reinforcements from arriving by sea. The sight of this armada must have been terrifying for the citizens watching from the ramparts, yet the Byzantines had their ultimate countermove ready. As the Ottoman ships approached the entrance to the Golden Horn, the defenders at the fortress executed their well-rehearsed drill. With a great groaning of winches, the massive iron chain, each link weighing a tremendous amount, was raised from the depths. It broke the surface of the water, slick and gleaming, supported by its wooden floats, forming an unbroken metallic wall across the narrow inlet. The Ottoman galleys, unable to penetrate this barrier, could only patrol impotently on the outside, their blockade rendered incomplete. The fortress had done its primary job perfectly. Frustrated, the Ottoman admirals decided to test the defenses. They launched probing attacks against the chain itself and the fortress walls, sending galleys forward in aggressive thrusts. This is when the Byzantines unveiled their most feared weapon, Greek fire. From specially designed siphons mounted on the decks of their own ships, which were safely positioned behind the chain, or from the walls of the fortress itself, Byzantine crews unleashed jets of this terrifying substance. It was a horrifying spectacle, a liquid fire that could not be extinguished with water that stuck to the wooden hulls and sails of the Ottoman ships, creating an inextinguishable inferno. The screams of burning sailors and the crackle of flames created a scene from a nightmare, forcing the Ottoman vessels to retreat in disarray. The psychological impact was immense. It reinforced the ancient legend of Byzantine naval invincibility. At the heart of this desperate defense was the last Roman emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos. He was no distant ruler watching from a palace. He was a constant presence on the front lines, moving along the walls of the city and the fortress, clad in armor, sharing the dangers and hardships with his soldiers. His leadership provided a crucial spark of hope, a symbol that the empire, though reduced to a single city, would fight for its existence with every ounce of its strength. For weeks, this grueling stalemate continued. The Ottomans would probe, the Byzantines would repel them. The Great Chain held, and Greek fire kept the Ottoman fleet at bay. It seemed for a glorious moment that the old empire's defenses might just hold. The fortress was proving its worth, and the defenders began to believe that perhaps, against all odds, they could survive. But Mehmed II was observing everything. He saw the limitations of the chain. It was a brilliant defense, but it was also a fixed, immobile object. He noted the positioning of the Byzantine ships clustered safely inside the Golden Horn. He understood that a direct assault on the chain was futile. Instead of being discouraged by these early failures, he was learning. The resilience of the defenders was not a reason to abandon the siege, but a challenge to be met with greater ingenuity. This initial phase of the conflict was a brutal tutorial in the strengths and weaknesses of his enemy, and the young Sultan was an exceptionally quick study. The stage was now set not for another conventional attack, but for one of the most breathtaking tactical maneuvers in military history. Faced with an impossible tactical problem, Sultan Mehmed II refused to accept defeat. He realized that the fortress and its chain were designed to defeat an enemy who played by the established rules of naval warfare. His solution, therefore, was to change the rules entirely. He would not break the chain, he would ignore it. The plan he conceived was so logistically ambitious and so audacious that his own advisors likely thought it was madness. It involved turning ships into land vehicles. The target was the area of Galata, a neutral Genoese trading colony located directly across the Bosporus from Constantinople. The Genoese, while officially neutral, were in a precarious position and could not afford to openly challenge the massive Ottoman army camped on their doorstep. Behind Galata rose a steep hill covered in forests, leading down to the northern shore of the Golden Horn. Mehmed's plan was to build a wooden roadway, a sort of marine railway, up this hill and over the crest, then down the other side, and to physically transport his warships from the waters of the Bosporus into the sheltered waters of the Golden Horn, completely behind the Byzantine defensive line. The scale of the operation was staggering. Thousands of laborers and carpenters were set to work. They cut a wide path through the woods and laid down a sturdy roadbed of wooden logs and planks, creating a smooth, sloped track. To reduce friction, they collected vast quantities of animal fat and grease, which they slathered liberally over the wooden rails. Meanwhile, the sailors of the Ottoman fleet prepared their vessels. They unloaded everything that wasn't nailed down: sails, ropes, supplies, weapons, to make the ships as light as possible. Then, on a moonless night to conceal their movements, the great endeavor began. Teams of oxen were hitched to the prows of the galleys, but the primary motive power came from the sheer muscle of thousands of men. Using ropes and pulleys, they began the Herculean task of dragging these heavy wooden ships. each one a significant weight even when empty, out of the water and onto the greased wooden track. Imagine the scene under the cover of darkness, the creaking of timbers, the shouts of the crews, the strain of men and animals pulling together in a coordinated effort of immense force. One by one, the ships were inched up the slope. It was a spectacle of raw human determination, a testament to the absolute will of the Ottoman command structure. From the walls of Constantinople, the defenders would have seen flickering lights and heard distant, indistinct noises from the Galata side, but they would have had no context for what was truly happening. They likely assumed it was some new land-based siege preparation. The idea that an entire fleet was being moved over a hill was so preposterous that it would not have even occurred to them as a possibility. By dawn, the impossible had been achieved. Dozens of Ottoman warships now floated in the Golden Horn, their oars dipping quietly into the water that had, just hours before, been the exclusive domain of the Byzantine fleet. The chain boom was still intact, the fortress walls were still unbreached, but their primary strategic purpose had been utterly negated. The Byzantines woke up to a nightmare. Their secure harbor was no longer secure. The psychological shock of seeing the enemy fleet materialize behind their main defense was catastrophic. The Ottomans had not just found a weakness in the Byzantine armor, they had created a new reality, proving that no defense, no matter how formidable, is safe from innovative and determined thought. The psychological blow of seeing the Ottoman fleet inside the Golden Horn was more devastating than any physical attack. For the defenders manning the walls of the fortress, it was a sight that defied reality. Their entire worldview, built upon the absolute security provided by the chain boom, collapsed in an instant. The harbor waters, which had been their safe haven, were now crawling with enemy galleys. The fortress, engineered to face outward and repel assaults from the open sea, suddenly found its back exposed. Its strongest walls now faced the wrong way, while its rear gates and lower fortifications, never intended to withstand a serious siege, looked out onto an enemy-controlled inlet. A deep sense of betrayal and shock rippled through the ranks. The myth of invincibility, their greatest intangible asset, evaporated under the cold light of that morning, replaced by a creeping dread that they were now trapped in their own fortress. Sultan Mehmed wasted no time in capitalizing on this disarray. He immediately ordered the cannons that had been bombarding the city's land walls to be repositioned. Some were painstakingly moved to the northern shore of the Golden Horn, directly opposite the fortress, while others were even placed on rafts to create floating batteries. This allowed for a concentrated crossfire bombardment targeting a specific, weaker section of the fortress's landward walls. The constant, thunderous roar of the great bombards was both a physical and psychological weapon. Each impact sent showers of stone and dust into the air, slowly but surely chewing away at the medieval masonry. The defenders could only watch as their protection was systematically dismantled piece by piece, the relentless pounding grinding down their resolve as effectively as it pulverized the stone. Then came the final, coordinated assault. It was a meticulously planned pincer movement. From the landward side, the elite Janissary regiments advanced in disciplined ranks, their advance covered by a hail of arrows from supporting archers. But the decisive thrust came from the water. The Ottoman galleys that had been dragged overland now served as mobile assault platforms. They swarmed the seaward walls of the fortress, their crews using grappling hooks and ladders to scale the defenses from a direction the Byzantines had never seriously fortified against a naval attack. The defenders were caught in a nightmare, forced to split their attention and their dwindling numbers between two fronts. The fighting was ferocious and intensely personal. The Byzantine soldiers, including Emperor Constantine himself, who had rushed to the sector, fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they were fighting for the very survival of their civilization. They hurled rocks, poured boiling pitch, and met the climbing Ottoman sword to sword on the battlements, but the tide was irreversible. The sheer weight of numbers and the shock of the unexpected attack from the harbor proved overwhelming. A breach was forced near one of the secondary gates, and a flood of Ottoman soldiers poured into the fortress's inner courtyard. The battle degenerated into a chaotic, bloody melee in the narrow passages and on the stairways. The raising of the Ottoman banner atop the highest bastion was the signal that the end had come. It was a swift and brutal conclusion. The fortress that had stood guard for centuries, the symbol of Byzantine naval power, had fallen in a matter of hours. The unthinkable had not just happened, it had happened with a shocking speed that sent a clear message to the world. The primary shield of Constantinople was gone, and the heart of the empire now lay exposed and undefended from the sea. The sound that followed was not just the clash of steel, but the shattering of a 1,000-year-old order. Word of the fortress's collapse did not travel by ship or by rider. It seemed to move through the very air, a current of dread carried on the wind from the Bosporus to the Adriatic. In the Doge's palace in Venice, where the fortunes of the Serenissima were calculated on ledgers and naval charts, the news landed like a physical blow. Venetian merchants whose wealth flowed through the Straits, now controlled by the Ottoman fleet, understood instantly that their business model, their entire way of life, was under existential threat. The fortress had been the lock on a door behind which they had operated with relative security. Now that lock was shattered, and the door swung open to a powerful new master who had no reason to honor old agreements or grant safe passage. Similar panic gripped the council halls of Genoa, Venice's great rival, which also possessed a vast network of trading posts and colonies that depended on free navigation. Overnight, the careful balance of power that had allowed these maritime republics to thrive was upended, but the shockwaves reached far beyond the merchant princes of Italy. In Rome, the papal court viewed the event not merely as a geopolitical shift, but as a spiritual catastrophe. The fall of the primary defense of Constantinople, the last great capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, was interpreted as a devastating blow to Christendom itself. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had served as a bulwark, a Christian shield holding back the advance of Islamic powers from the East. Even in its weakened state, its very existence had forced the Ottomans to focus their energies on its conquest. With that shield now gone, the path seemed clear for an Ottoman advance directly into the heart of Europe. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. A deep-seated fear, a sense of vulnerability not felt since the days of the Viking raids or the Mongol incursions, began to seep into the consciousness of every kingdom from the Balkans to the Iberian Peninsula. The impossible had happened, and if the invincible fortress could fall, what city was truly safe? The military implications were just as immediate and stark. The Ottoman fleet, which had just weeks before been thwarted by the chain and Greek fire, now enjoyed an unimaginable strategic advantage. The Golden Horn, one of the finest natural harbors in the world, was theirs. This provided a perfectly sheltered base where ships could be repaired, crews could rest, and new campaigns could be launched with impunity. The Ottoman navy was no longer a blockading force operating on hostile shores. It was now a resident power, dug deep into the very heart of its enemy's territory. This allowed them to resupply their land armies besieging Constantinople with devastating efficiency, tightening the noose around the city in a way that had previously been impossible. More broadly, it signaled the birth of a true blue-water Ottoman navy. They had not just won a battle, they had captured the infrastructure and the strategic position to dominate the entire eastern Mediterranean for the foreseeable future. The age of Byzantine naval supremacy was over, and a new, unpredictable era had dawned, leaving every other power in the region scrambling to reassess their place in a suddenly unfamiliar world. With the fortress fallen, Constantinople was no longer a city under siege. It was a city suffocating. The Golden Horn, once its life-giving artery, had become a noose. Ottoman galleys now patrolled those sheltered waters with impunity, their oars dipping silently where only Byzantine ships had sailed weeks before. This control granted the besiegers a devastating new advantage: the ability to assault the city's seawalls, which were historically its weaker flank. These northern defenses, which ran along the shoreline of the Golden Horn, had never been constructed to the same immense scale as the legendary land walls. They were more vulnerable, and now, for the first time in the siege, they were directly accessible to the Ottoman army. The defenders, already stretched to their absolute limit along the massive landward fortifications, were forced to thin their ranks further, rushing soldiers to man these suddenly threatened seaward bastions. It was a strategic nightmare, splitting their already outnumbered forces at the most critical moment. The psychological impact of this development was perhaps even more crippling than the military one. For the citizens and soldiers trapped inside the walls, the sight of the enemy fleet in their harbor was a constant, demoralizing reminder that their world was ending. Any lingering hope of a miraculous naval rescue from the west, from Venice or the Pope, evaporated. A relief force would now have to not only break the Ottoman blockade in the open sea, but also fight its way through a hostile fleet anchored in the city's own harbor, a task that was militarily impossible. The defenders were truly alone, surrounded on all sides, with the sounds of the enemy camp now echoing across the water that was supposed to be their shield. The final, fragile thread connecting Constantinople to the outside world had been severed. Sultan Mehmed, sensing the city's desperation, intensified the pressure relentlessly. The great cannons, including the massive bombard that had been pounding the land walls for weeks, now maintained an almost constant barrage, but the real innovation came from the Golden Horn. The Ottomans constructed floating artillery platforms, essentially rafts mounted with smaller cannons, which they positioned just offshore from the seawalls. This allowed for a precise, concentrated bombardment on specific weak points that the land-based artillery could not easily target. The defenders on the seawalls found themselves under a new kind of fire, a crossfire from both land and water, making it incredibly dangerous even to stand their post. The city was being systematically pounded into submission from every conceivable angle. Yet, even in this hopeless situation, the resolve of the defenders, led personally by Emperor Constantine XI, did not completely break. They fought with a courage born of absolute despair, knowing they were the last guardians of a 1,500-year-old empire. They patched breaches in the walls with whatever timber and rubble they could find, often under a hail of arrows and cannonballs. They launched desperate sorties to disrupt Ottoman siege works, knowing full well they were unlikely to return. The emperor himself, refusing to surrender or flee, moved from crisis point to crisis point, a ghost of the Roman Empire rallying his few remaining loyal soldiers. Their struggle was no longer for victory, but for honor. The final assault, when it came, was as brutal as it was inevitable. In the early hours of May 29, 1453, after a night of prayer and eerie silence from the Ottoman lines, the entire army surged forward. The attack was coordinated with precision. While the main Janissary regiments hurled themselves against the battered land walls at the St. Romanus Gate, a secondary assault was launched from the Ottoman fleet in the Golden Horn against the sea walls. The defenders, split and exhausted, fought until their swords broke and their strength failed. It was at the land walls that the fate of the city was ultimately decided. A small postern gate, the Kirkeporta, was either left open by accident or forced open by the attackers, allowing a flood of Ottoman soldiers to pour into the city behind the main defensive lines. The cry of "the city is taken" spread like wildfire and the defense collapsed. The fall of Constantinople was more than the capture of a city, it was the extinguishing of a light. The Roman Empire, which had endured in some form since the time of Augustus, ceased to exist on that day. Emperor Constantine XI, in a final act of symbolic defiance, cast off his imperial purple robes and plunged into the fiercest fighting, dying anonymously among his soldiers. His body was never formally identified. For the Ottoman Empire, it was the ultimate validation. Mehmed II entered the city not as a destroyer, but as a new emperor, styling himself Caesar of Rome and making Constantinople, which he renamed Istanbul, the new capital of his burgeoning empire. The conquest shifted the center of geopolitical gravity from Western Europe to the Bosporus, establishing Ottoman hegemony over the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans for centuries to come. The domino, pushed by the fall of a single fortress, had toppled the ancient world's final pillar. The capture of the fortress, and with it the city of Constantinople, handed the Ottoman Empire the keys to the world's most valuable toll booth. For the first time, a single power controlled both shores of the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, the narrow straits that formed the only maritime gateway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. This was not just a military victory, it was an economic stranglehold of breathtaking proportions. The Ottomans now sat astride the primary commercial superhighway of the medieval world. Every ship carrying grain from the fertile plains of Ukraine to the hungry cities of Italy, every vessel laden with spices from the Silk Road terminals on the Black Sea coast, every merchant galley transporting silks, furs, and slaves had to pass directly under the gaze of Ottoman fortresses and pay a heavy price for the privilege. The new masters of the Straits imposed steep tariffs, demanded official permits, and could grant or deny passage on a whim. Control of this choke point became an immense and steady source of revenue for the Ottoman treasury, funding their further expansion and solidifying their power for generations to come. This sudden shift sent a shockwave through the boardrooms and counting houses of Europe's great maritime republics. For Venice and Genoa, whose immense wealth was built entirely on their role as middlemen in this east-west trade, the Ottoman takeover was nothing short of a commercial catastrophe. Their business model was elegant and highly profitable. They would acquire luxury goods like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves from Arab traders in ports like Alexandria, or from their own trading posts in the Black Sea, and then sell them at a massive markup to a luxury-starved European aristocracy. The fall of Constantinople shattered this system. The Genoese colony of Galata, which had maintained a precarious neutrality, was now completely subsumed within the Ottoman sphere. Venetian trading privileges negotiated with a weak Byzantine emperor were abruptly revoked. Their merchants were now operating at the sufferance of a powerful and often hostile new authority who viewed them with deep suspicion. The predictable, established routes that had fueled the Italian Renaissance with gold were now fraught with uncertainty, political risk, and exorbitant new costs. Faced with this existential threat to their prosperity, the merchant princes of Venice and Genoa initially did what they knew best. They tried to negotiate and adapt. They sent ambassadors to the court of Sultan Mehmed, offering lavish gifts and seeking to secure new trade agreements. For a time, a tense and often interrupted commerce continued. But this was a fundamentally different relationship. They were no longer dealing with a weak partner desperate for their support. They were dealing with a dominant power that could set the terms unilaterally. The Ottomans cleverly played the Italian rivals against each other, granting concessions to one to undermine the other. ensuring neither republic could ever regain its former influence. This constant instability and the ever-present threat of sudden embargoes or confiscations made the old Mediterranean routes a far less reliable source of wealth. The very foundation of their economic power was cracking. It was this profound sense of vulnerability and the urgent need to circumvent the Ottoman monopoly that planted the seed for a radical new idea. If you could not go through the Mediterranean, you must find a way to go around it. The search for alternative routes to the fabled riches of the East, particularly to the source of spices in India and the Spice Islands, became a strategic imperative for the kingdoms on Europe's Atlantic coast. Portugal, under the visionary leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, was the first to seriously commit to this endeavor. While the Italians were trapped in their Mediterranean chess game with the Ottomans, Portuguese captains began pushing further and further down the coast of West Africa, year after year, in a methodical campaign to find a sea route to India that would bypass the Islamic world entirely. Their success was staggering. In 1498, Vasco da Gama's fleet rounded the Cape of Good Hope and sailed into the Indian Ocean, opening a direct maritime path to the source of the spice trade. The implications of this Portuguese breakthrough were world historic. Spices that once had to be transported overland along the Silk Road, then through the Ottoman-controlled Straits, and finally into the hands of Italian merchants, could now be loaded directly onto Portuguese caravels in Indian ports and sailed back to Lisbon. This cut out every single middleman, from the Arab traders to the Ottoman tax collectors to the Venetian wholesalers. Lisbon suddenly exploded as the new spice capital of Europe, while the Venetian warehouses began to gather dust. The success of the Portuguese experiment did not go unnoticed. In the Spanish court of Ferdinand and Isabella, an Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus proposed an even more audacious theory, that one could reach the East by sailing west across the uncharted Atlantic Ocean. His famous voyage in 1492, funded by a Spanish crown eager to not be left behind in the race for new routes, was a direct consequence of the Ottoman closure of the traditional paths. While Columbus famously miscalculated the size of the Earth and stumbled upon the Americas instead of Asia, his accidental discovery unlocked fortunes far greater than any spice route could offer. The age of exploration, with all its world-changing consequences, was set in motion by a chain reaction that began with the fall of a single fortress on the Golden Horn. The Ottoman victory, intended to consolidate their power in the Mediterranean, had the unintended effect of pushing European ambition out into the vastness of the global ocean, forever shifting the center of world power from the inland sea to the Atlantic. The astonishing feat of dragging warships over a hill did more than just win a siege. It fundamentally rewrote the book on how to fight a war at sea. For centuries, naval dominance had been a game of controlling key points, a fortified harbor here, a narrow strait there. The ultimate expression of this philosophy was the Great Chain and the fortress that guarded it, a system designed to force an enemy into a predictable and ultimately suicidal confrontation. What Sultan Mehmed II demonstrated was that the greatest strength of a static defense is also its greatest weakness. It cannot move. By refusing to play the game on his enemy's terms, he rendered their most powerful asset obsolete. This was not a victory achieved by building a bigger, better ship for a cannon-to-cannon duel. It was a victory of imagination over inertia, of mobility over masonry. The message to every admiral and king watching from afar was chillingly clear. A fortress, no matter how strong, is only as good as the assumption that your enemy will attack it head-on. This single event acted as a powerful catalyst, accelerating a shift in military thinking that was already beginning to stir. The lesson was absorbed with particular urgency in the maritime capitals of Europe. If a fixed harbor defense could be so decisively bypassed, then the true source of naval power must lie not in the fortifications on the shore, but in the capabilities of the fleet itself. The focus began to swing away from building impregnable walls and towards constructing vessels that could operate independently for long periods, far from friendly ports. This meant designing ships that were not just floating platforms for soldiers, as Mediterranean galleys largely were, but stable, sturdy castles of wood and sail capable of weathering the fierce storms of the open ocean. The era of the true sailing ship, the carrack and later the galleon, was dawning. These were vessels with high forecastles and aft castles, armed with increasingly powerful cannons mounted along their sides, transforming them from troop carriers into floating artillery batteries. The goal was no longer to ram and board an enemy, but to stand off and blast them to pieces from a distance. This new doctrine of sea power demanded a parallel revolution in naval artillery. The massive bombards used by the Ottomans to break the walls of Constantinople had proven the devastating effect of gunpowder. Now that power needed to be made mobile and seaworthy. European foundries began experimenting with casting smaller, more manageable, yet still powerful, bronze and iron cannons that could be effectively mounted on the rolling decks of a ship. The development of the gunport was a seemingly simple but utterly transformative innovation. By cutting holes in the hull of a ship just above the waterline, naval architects could mount heavy cannons on the lower decks, creating a broadside, a simultaneous volley from dozens of guns that could unleash a storm of iron onto an enemy vessel. This concentration of firepower meant that a single well-armed galleon could now pose a threat that would have required an entire fleet of galleys just a generation earlier. The ship itself was becoming the weapon. The nations that embraced this new reality most fervently were those with Atlantic coastlines, who had both the incentive and the opportunity to look beyond the confined waters of the Mediterranean. Portugal and Spain, spurred by the Ottoman dominance of the old trade routes, were at the forefront of this oceanic revolution. Their shipyards became hives of innovation, perfecting the designs of caravels and naus that could voyage for months across uncharted seas. This was not just about exploration, it was about building a new kind of empire, a network of power projected across thousands of miles of ocean. They understood that in this new age, control would be exercised by the fleet that could appear off any coast, anywhere in the world, without needing a friendly fortified harbor to operate from. Their success in the Indian Ocean and the Americas provided stunning proof of concept, demonstrating that oceanic mobility could bring rewards on a scale that dwarfed the traditional squabbles over Mediterranean islands. The older naval powers, particularly Venice and the Ottoman Empire itself, found this transition more challenging. They were deeply invested in the existing paradigm of galley warfare, which was ideal for the calm, predictable seas of the Mediterranean. Their entire infrastructure, their tactics, and their shipbuilding traditions were built around it. While they would eventually adapt, incorporating larger sailing ships into their fleets, they were often playing catch-up to the Atlantic powers who had embraced the new model from the start. The stage was now set for a different kind of conflict, no longer a struggle over a single fortress or strait, but a globe-spanning competition. The great naval arms races of the 16th and 17th centuries, which would see the rise of the English Royal Navy and the Dutch fleet, were a direct consequence of the lesson learned from the Golden Horn. The future of naval dominance would be decided not by who controlled the best anchorages, but by who could build the most powerful, far-ranging, and innovative fleets, capable of carrying an empire's ambitions to the very ends of the earth. The capture of Constantinople handed the Ottomans a prize beyond mere territory, the keys to a maritime empire. The city's location, astride the Bosporus, provided them with one of the most formidable natural harbors on Earth, the Golden Horn. This deep, sheltered inlet, now entirely under their control, became the beating heart of their naval ambition. It was more than just a safe anchorage. It was a vast, ready-made shipyard, a logistical hub, and an unassailable base of operations from which they could project power across the entire eastern Mediterranean. With this strategic windfall, the Ottoman state embarked on a shipbuilding program of staggering scale. The quiet coves around the capital echoed with the sounds of saws and hammers as new docks and arsenals sprang to life, turning out galleys and larger sailing ships at an unprecedented rate. The navy was no longer a secondary tool to support the army. It was now understood as the essential instrument for securing and expanding their new sea-based dominion. This transformation was driven by a clear strategic vision. The Ottomans recognized that their sprawling empire, which now stretched across 3 continents, depended on secure sea lanes. To hold their territories in Greece, the Balkans, and Anatolia, and to push further into the Aegean and Adriatic seas, they needed a fleet capable of both conquest and control. They systematically integrated the maritime knowledge of the peoples they had conquered, particularly the skilled Greek and Genoese sailors who now served the Sultan. This fusion of Ottoman discipline with generations of Mediterranean seafaring expertise created a uniquely formidable force. Their galleys, powered by rows of oarsmen and equipped with formidable boarding parties, were perfect for the calm, coastal waters where most naval combat occurred. But they also began building larger, sail-powered galleasses, vessels that could carry more troops and heavier artillery, signaling their intent to dominate not just the coasts but the open sea as well. For the next 100 years, this powerhouse of a navy asserted its dominance with relentless force. The primary challengers were the great Christian maritime states, who formed shifting alliances in a desperate attempt to contain the Ottoman tide. The Republic of Venice, with its string of fortified islands and trading posts across the Aegean, found itself in a constant, draining struggle. The once lucrative trade routes that were the source of Venetian wealth became battlegrounds. In war after war, the Ottoman fleet would descend upon Venetian colonies like Negropont and Cyprus, besieging their fortresses and challenging Venetian squadrons sent to relieve them. While the Venetians were skilled and determined sailors, they were often outbuilt and outmaneuvered by the vast resources and centralized command of the Ottoman navy. Each conflict sapped Venetian strength, forcing the Republic to spend its fortune on defense rather than commerce, a slow bleed that marked the beginning of its long decline from a premier power to a secondary state. The scope of Ottoman ambition stretched across the entire Mediterranean. They clashed with the Spanish, whose own navy was emerging as a powerful force. Ottoman corsairs, operating with the tacit support of the Sultan, raided the coasts of Spain and Italy, striking fear into coastal communities and carrying off captives. This was not mere piracy. It was a form of asymmetrical warfare that kept their enemies perpetually off balance. The high point of this offensive strategy came in the 1560s with the epic siege of Malta. A massive Ottoman armada descended upon the island fortress of the Knights Hospitaller, the last remaining Christian naval thorn in their side. The siege was a brutal affair that ultimately failed, but the very fact that the Ottomans could project power so far from their home bases, threatening the central Mediterranean, demonstrated the incredible reach they had achieved. Their navy was not just a defensive shield, it was a sword capable of striking at the heart of Christendom. This century of Ottoman naval supremacy had a profound psychological and strategic impact on Europe. The constant threat forced the Christian powers into a largely defensive posture. Coastal cities from Sicily to Dalmatia invested heavily in building new fortifications and watchtowers, creating a landscape of fear. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake and then a contested space, began to feel like an Ottoman lake. Christian naval campaigns were often reactive, aimed at relieving a besieged outpost or countering a specific raid, rather than pursuing any grand strategy of rolling back Ottoman gains. This defensive mindset stifled innovation and coordination among the rival European states, who often struggled to set aside their own differences to face the common threat. The confidence of the Christian world, already shaken by the fall of Constantinople, was further eroded by the seemingly unstoppable rise of the Ottoman fleet. For decades, it appeared that the destiny of the inland sea was to be ruled from Istanbul, a reality that every sailor, merchant, and king had no choice but to accept. Yet the true impact of the fortress's fall was not measured solely in lost territory or broken chains, but in the profound shock it sent reverberating through the collective psyche of an entire continent. For centuries, the very existence of the Byzantine Empire, even in its diminished state, had provided Christendom with a crucial psychological comfort. It was a living relic of Rome, a symbolic bulwark that stood between the familiar world of Europe and what was perceived as the vast, unknown powers of the East. The mighty walls of Constantinople and the legendary defenses of the Golden Horn were not just physical barriers, they were articles of faith. They represented the idea that the ancient order, the divine favor of a Christian world, would ultimately hold firm against any storm. The sudden, dramatic collapse of this thousand-year-old shield was therefore more than a military defeat. It was a spiritual and psychological cataclysm. The impossible had not only happened, it had happened with a speed and finality that suggested the old rules of the world no longer applied. If the unbreachable could be breached, then what city, what kingdom, what faith was truly safe? This event gave birth to a powerful and enduring specter that would haunt European diplomacy and popular imagination for generations: the Turkish threat. This was not merely a fear of a rival empire. It was a potent mixture of religious dread, racial anxiety, and geopolitical alarm. Sermons from pulpits across Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire began to depict the Ottoman Sultan not just as a conqueror, but as a scourge of God, a precursor to the Antichrist. This religious framing transformed a political conflict into an existential struggle, fueling a pervasive sense of vulnerability that reached from the halls of kings to the simplest peasant villages. The fear was no longer abstract, it became tangible. Coastal communities across the Mediterranean, from Sicily to the Adriatic, lived with the genuine dread of seeing Ottoman sails on the horizon, a fear of raids and enslavement that had been unthinkable just a generation before. The sea itself, once a source of connection and commerce, was now perceived as a highway for invasion. This deep-seated anxiety fundamentally reshaped the political landscape of Europe. The constant Ottoman pressure acted as a powerful, if reluctant, motivator for alliance. It forced bitter rivals to consider cooperation against a common enemy they perceived as far more dangerous. Popes issued calls for crusade, attempting to unite the perpetually squabbling kingdoms of Christendom. While these grand alliances often faltered on the rocks of national self-interest, the threat did lead to more pragmatic, if temporary, coalitions. The need for a unified Christian front became a recurring theme in statecraft, a diplomatic challenge that every European monarch had to navigate. The psychological impact even influenced art and literature. The archetype of the menacing Turk became a staple of plays and poems, a symbol of formidable and often cruel power that both terrified and fascinated the European mind. On a strategic level, the shock of the fortress's fall instilled a lasting caution in European military thinking. The event served as a brutal object lesson in the dangers of over-reliance on static defenses. Military engineers across Italy and beyond began to study the failure, leading to a revolution in fortress design. The old, high-walled castles that had dominated the landscape for centuries were now seen as vulnerable. The new model, exemplified by the Trace Italian or Star Fort, featured low, thick, angled walls that were specifically designed to better absorb cannon fire and eliminate blind spots, offering defenders overlapping fields of fire against any approach. This was a direct architectural response to the lesson of the Golden Horn, that a fortress must be prepared for an attack from any direction, and that its greatest strength could become its most fatal weakness if it lacked flexibility. The confidence that had once placed absolute faith in stone and mortar was gone, replaced by a more anxious but ultimately more sophisticated understanding of defense. The world had learned that no wall, no matter how legendary, could stand forever against determined ingenuity, and that lesson would echo through the battlefields of Europe for centuries to come. While the Ottoman victory consolidated their power, it presented an existential crisis for the republic that had styled itself the Serenissima, the most serene republic of Venice. For centuries, Venetian wealth was not rooted in vast farmlands or mineral resources, but in the flow of goods across the water. Their entire identity was maritime. They were the quintessential middlemen, their fortunes built on a delicate and incredibly profitable system. Their merchants would acquire precious spices, silks, and other luxuries from the East and sell them at a massive markup to the courts and cities of Europe. The fall of the fortress and the subsequent Ottoman dominance of the Bosporus shattered the predictable world in which this system thrived. The sea lanes that were Venice's lifeblood were now patrolled by a powerful, often hostile navy that viewed the Italian Republic not as a partner, but as a rival to be contained or crushed. The secure trading environment they had enjoyed, often through negotiated treaties with a weaker Byzantine empire, vanished overnight, replaced by a precarious reality of sudden embargoes, confiscated cargoes, and spiraling costs. This new threat forced Venice into a strategic pivot of monumental scale. The Republic could not simply retreat. Its survival depended on its presence at sea. Consequently, it embarked on a century-long struggle, a series of draining wars against the Ottoman Empire that historians would later call the Ottoman-Venetian Wars. This was not a single conflict but a relentless cycle of hostilities, punctuated by tense and often broken truces. The battlefields were not just the open water, but the dozens of fortified islands and coastal strongholds that formed the backbone of Venice's maritime empire. Places like Negropont in Euboea, the island of Cyprus, and the strategic fortress of Modon in the Peloponnese became the flashpoints. Venetian galley fleets, once primarily instruments of commerce protection, were now perpetually on a war footing, dispatched to relieve besieged colonies, challenge Ottoman squadrons, and protect vulnerable convoys of merchant ships. Every voyage became a potential military engagement. The financial cost of this permanent state of war was staggering and fundamentally altered the Venetian state. The serene coffers that had been filled with the profits of peace were now relentlessly drained to fund the construction of new warships, the recruitment of mercenary armies, and the fortification of far-flung outposts. Taxes soared on the citizens of Venice itself. The vibrant, profit-driven energy that had characterized the Republic was increasingly channeled into a grim struggle for survival. This constant military expenditure created a vicious cycle. The more resources Venice spent on defending its existing trade routes, the less capital it had available for the kind of speculative, long-distance ventures that were now making Portugal and Spain fabulously wealthy. While Atlantic powers were investing in global exploration, Venice was forced to spend its fortune merely to hold the line in its own backyard, a strategic dilemma from which it would never fully recover. This unending conflict also forced a profound evolution in Venetian naval doctrine. They could no longer afford to build ships designed solely for speed and cargo capacity. The galley, the workhorse of the Mediterranean, had to be adapted for war. The Venetians became masters of producing the galea grossa, or great galley, a larger, sturdier vessel capable of carrying more soldiers and heavier artillery. Their famous arsenal, the heart of Venetian shipbuilding, transformed from a commercial enterprise into a dedicated military-industrial complex. It was a marvel of pre-industrial efficiency, capable of fitting out, arming, and supplying a fully equipped galley in the time it took a man to eat a meal. This shift to a permanent war economy was a testament to their resilience, but it also locked them into a defensive, reactive posture. Their strategy was no longer about expanding trade, but about preserving what they had left. The psychological toll on the Venetian psyche was as significant as the financial one. The confidence of the Serenissima, once so absolute, was replaced by a deep-seated anxiety. The Ottoman threat became the central, organizing principle of Venetian foreign policy for 100 years, dictating alliances and dictating sacrifices. The struggle culminated in one of the most significant naval battles of the era, the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where a Venetian-led Holy League fleet achieved a monumental victory over the Ottomans. Yet, even this great triumph proved fleeting. While it shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility and provided a massive morale boost to Christendom, Venice, exhausted and financially crippled, was unable to leverage the victory into lasting strategic gains. They soon found themselves negotiating a peace that returned many of the concessions they had fought for, a clear sign that their power was waning. The century-long dilemma had forced Venice to become a warrior republic, but in doing so, it had irrevocably undermined the commercial vitality that had been the source of its greatness, setting the stage for a long, graceful, but undeniable decline. While the Venetians fought a desperate rearguard action to preserve their existing trade, a new power was rising on the far western edge of the Mediterranean, one that viewed the Ottoman threat not as a crisis to be managed, but as a divine challenge to be met with overwhelming force. The recently unified kingdoms of Spain, forged in the centuries-long struggle of the Reconquista to drive Muslim powers from the Iberian Peninsula, saw the Ottoman conquests in the east as a continuation of the same existential conflict. For the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the fall of Constantinople was not a distant geopolitical event. It was a stark warning and a call to action. Having finally captured Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, in 1492, they now looked out across the Mediterranean and saw a new, far more powerful Islamic empire filling the vacuum. The lesson was clear: their hard-won unity and security would be meaningless if they could not also secure the sea lanes. The relentless, crusading spirit that had defined their campaign on land was now systematically applied to the water. This was not a tentative exploration but a full-scale national project. Spain recognized that to counter the Ottoman navy, they needed more than just a collection of armed merchant ships. They required a dedicated, state-funded professional fighting force. The experience of the Reconquista provided a ready-made template. They had developed sophisticated systems for supplying large armies in the field, for building siege engines, and for mobilizing the resources of an entire kingdom towards a single military objective. These logistical and organizational skills were directly transferred to the naval sphere. The Spanish crown began investing heavily in royal shipyards, most notably at Barcelona and later in Seville, where the focus shifted from building versatile caravels for exploration to constructing powerful, specialized warships. The most important of these was the galleon, a vessel that perfectly blended the ocean-going capabilities of the carrack with the maneuverability and firepower needed for Mediterranean combat. These were floating fortresses designed from the keel up to carry a devastating broadside of heavy cannons and to withstand the rigors of both Atlantic storms and fierce naval engagements. This naval expansion was driven by a two-pronged strategy. On one front, Spain aimed to challenge Ottoman power directly in its own backyard. The Spanish fleet, often in alliance with Venetian and Papal forces, became a constant thorn in the Ottoman side. They fought numerous engagements across the Western Mediterranean, contesting control of North African ports like Oran and Tunis, which were vital bases for Ottoman corsairs. The most famous of these campaigns was the capture of the strategic stronghold of La Golta and Tunis in 1535, led by the legendary Genoese Admiral Andrea Doria in the service of Emperor Charles V. This demonstrated that Spanish power could be projected deep into what the Ottomans considered their sphere of influence. It was a clear declaration that Spain would not cede the Mediterranean without a fight. The second, and ultimately more world-changing, prong of their strategy was to circumvent the Ottoman threat entirely by mastering the Atlantic Ocean. The same drive that fueled their Mediterranean ambitions also propelled their explorers westward. The voyages of Christopher Columbus, funded by Isabella, were part of this grand strategic picture. The goal was to find an alternative route to the riches of the East, bypassing the Ottoman-controlled choke points. While this led to the accidental discovery of the Americas, it unlocked a source of wealth that would eventually dwarf the spice trade. The vast quantities of silver flowing from mines in Mexico and Peru into the Spanish treasury provided the financial fuel for their massive naval buildup. This Atlantic focus did not replace their Mediterranean ambitions, it supercharged them. The wealth of the New World paid for the galleons that would defend the Old. This immense effort culminated in the creation of the Spanish Armada, a fleet that embodied the nation's dual oceanic destiny. While often remembered for its failed invasion of England in 1588, the Armada was conceived as much for Mediterranean as for Atlantic warfare. It was the ultimate expression of Spain's naval philosophy, a powerful, centralized fleet capable of defending a global empire. The ships were larger, carried more soldiers, and were better armed than almost any other vessels afloat. The Armada was a direct response to the kind of naval power the Ottomans had demonstrated a century earlier, a permanent, professional force designed to secure sea lanes and project imperial power. The challenge posed by the fall of a single fortress on the Golden Horn had reverberated across Europe, and in Spain, it found a response that was both fervent and formidable, forging a navy that would dominate the world's oceans for the next 100 years and shape the course of modern history. Even as the Ottoman navy solidified its grip on the wider Mediterranean, one persistent and galling thorn remained firmly embedded in its side: the island fortress of Rhodes, home to the legendary Knights Hospitaller. This was no ordinary kingdom or republic. It was a military religious order, a brotherhood of warrior monks who had sworn oaths of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but whose primary vocation had become holy war. After being expelled from their previous stronghold in the Holy Land, the Knights had transformed Rhodes into an impregnable citadel and a base for a new kind of crusade, one fought not on the plains of Palestine, but across the sea lanes of the Aegean. In the New World Order defined by Ottoman supremacy, the Knights became something far more significant than just a holdout. They evolved into the last active, aggressive Christian naval power capable of challenging Ottoman control directly. Their continued presence was a direct and humiliating challenge to the Sultan's claim of absolute dominance over the sea. the Knights perfected a form of naval guerrilla warfare that was both economically devastating and psychologically unnerving for the Ottomans. Their fleet, though modest in size compared to the vast Ottoman armada, was composed of swift, highly maneuverable galleys crewed by some of the most experienced and motivated sailors in the Mediterranean. These were not sailors by trade, but knights by vocation who had mastered the art of war at sea. They operated like maritime predators, lurking in the coves and islands of the Dodecanese archipelago, waiting to pounce on Ottoman shipping convoys. Their targets were the lifelines of the empire, supply ships carrying grain from Egypt to feed Constantinople, transports moving troops between Anatolia and the Balkans, and most tantalizingly, merchant vessels laden with the immense wealth that flowed through Ottoman ports. A successful raid could net the Knights a fortune in gold, goods, and captives, which they would then use to finance further operations, creating a self-sustaining cycle of conflict that bled the Ottoman economy. The strategic impact of this constant harassment was profound. The Ottoman Empire, for all its power, was forced to divert a significant portion of its naval resources away from grand campaigns of expansion simply to protect its own vital sea lanes. The Aegean Sea, which should have been an Ottoman lake, became a contested and dangerous frontier. Convoys had to be accompanied by powerful escorts, a costly and logistically complex undertaking that slowed down trade and military logistics. The Ottomans could never fully secure their maritime communications as long as the Knights of Rhodes remained operational. This persistent threat meant that the Ottoman navy, despite its overwhelming strength, was never free to focus its entire might on its European rivals like Venice or Spain. The Knights, in essence, acted as a force multiplier for all of Christendom, tying down Ottoman ships and attention that would have otherwise been deployed elsewhere. The struggle for Rhodes became a dramatic microcosm of the larger century-long conflict, a distilled version of the clash between Ottoman imperial power and Christian resistance. For the Knights, holding the island was a matter of sacred duty and survival. Their entire identity was bound up in their role as defenders of Christendom against Islam. Every Ottoman merchant ship captured was not just a prize, it was a blow struck for the faith. For the Ottomans, however, the continued existence of this militant outpost so close to their Anatolian heartland was an intolerable affront to their sovereignty and a glaring vulnerability in their defensive perimeter. Rhodes was a dagger pointed at the soft underbelly of their empire, a constant reminder that their naval dominance was incomplete. This simmering conflict could not continue indefinitely. The resolve of the Knights and the growing irritation of the Ottomans set the stage for an inevitable confrontation. It would take several decades and the reign of a new, equally determined Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, to finally decide that the nuisance of Rhodes had to be eliminated once and for all. The epic siege that followed would be one of the most brutal and heroic stands of the era, a testament to the Knights' unwavering resolve and a demonstration of the immense effort the Ottomans were forced to expend to secure their hard-won control of the sea. The story of the Knights Hospitaller on Rhodes is the story of how a small, dedicated force can leverage its position and audacity to challenge an empire, proving that true control is not just about possessing overwhelming force, but about the will to use it and the difficulty of extinguishing a determined enemy's will to resist. For more than a century, the shadow cast by the fall of the fortress and the conquest of Constantinople had stretched across the Mediterranean, a long twilight of Ottoman naval supremacy. But in the autumn of 1571, that shadow was finally challenged by a blaze of concentrated force. The stage was set in the Gulf of Patras, near the town of Lepanto in western Greece. Here, the largest Ottoman fleet ever assembled, a vast armada of nearly 300 galleys, was poised to deliver what they hoped would be a knockout blow to Christian resistance in the region. Commanded by the experienced Ali Pasha, this fleet represented the full might of the Sultan, a force that had for generations dictated terms on the water. Yet sailing to meet them was something the Mediterranean had not seen in living memory, a unified Christian fleet. This was the Holy League, a fragile but potent coalition forged by the diplomatic skill of Pope Pius V, bringing together the navies of Spain, Venice, the Papal States, and several other Italian principalities. For once, the perennial rivals had set aside their squabbles to face a common enemy. The very existence of this alliance was a direct response to the century of pressure that began with the loss of the Golden Horn. The two fleets that closed on each other on the morning of October 7th were a study in contrasts, reflecting the different naval philosophies that had evolved over the preceding 100 years. The Ottoman galleys were fast, agile, and packed with skilled archers and elite Janissary soldiers. Their primary tactic was the classic Mediterranean maneuver: close quickly, rake the enemy deck with arrows, and then board for a close-quarters melee where their soldiers' discipline would prevail. The Christian fleet, however, particularly its core of Spanish and Venetian vessels, had adapted. While they also relied on galleys, their strategy incorporated a new, decisive element: 6 massive Venetian galleasses. These were hybrid warships, slower and less maneuverable than galleys, but veritable floating fortresses. They were propelled by both sail and oar, and their key innovation was their ability to mount dozens of heavy cannons along their sides. Towed ahead of the main Christian battle line, these galleasses were designed to break up the Ottoman formation before it could even reach the galleys, using overwhelming firepower to shatter the enemy's traditional tactics. As the battle lines converged, the air grew thick with the sound of prayers and the beating of drums setting the stroke for thousands of oarsmen. The initial phase unfolded exactly as the Holy League's commander, Don John of Austria, the young half-brother of the Spanish king, had hoped. The Ottoman fleet, confident in its numerical superiority and fighting spirit, surged forward, but as they approached, they had to navigate around the hulking galleasses. This was their undoing. As the Ottoman galleys came within range, the galleasses unleashed their broadsides. The effect was catastrophic. Volleys of cannonballs, some weighing dozens of pounds, smashed through the light wooden hulls of the Turkish vessels, sinking some outright and throwing the entire attacking formation into disarray. The orderly advance dissolved into chaos, giving the Christian galleys the crucial advantage they needed to engage the disrupted enemy on their own terms. What followed was not a single battle, but a sprawling, chaotic, and intensely personal series of conflicts across miles of water. The fighting devolved into a brutal slog of ship-to-ship boarding actions. The central clash was a dramatic duel between the two flagships. Don John's Real and Ali Pasha's Sultana locked together, becoming a single, bloody battlefield. Spanish infantry and Italian marines clashed with Janissaries in a fierce struggle for the decks, a microcosm of the wider religious and imperial conflict. The outcome hung in the balance for hours, with the tide of the larger battle shifting back and forth. But the Holy League soldiers, many of them hardened veterans of Spain's terrestrial campaigns, gradually gained the upper hand in these close-quarter combats. The death of Ali Pasha, whose head was raised on a pike, shattered Ottoman morale. By afternoon, the victory was complete. The Ottoman fleet was shattered, with over 200 ships captured or sunk, thousands of Christian slaves freed from the oars, and tens of thousands of Ottoman sailors and soldiers lost. The immediate strategic impact of Lepanto was, perhaps surprisingly, limited. The Ottoman Empire, with its immense resources and shipbuilding capacity, rebuilt its fleet within a year. They retained control of Cyprus, the island whose invasion had provoked the Holy League into existence. Yet, to view Lepanto solely through the lens of territory gained or lost is to miss its profound and lasting significance. The battle was a psychological earthquake. In a single day, it shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility at sea that had persisted since 1453. The spell was broken. The news of the victory ignited celebrations across Europe, from Rome to London. It was hailed as a miracle, a divine intervention that had finally checked the seemingly inexorable advance of the Ottoman Empire. For the men and women who had lived their entire lives under the shadow of the Turkish threat, Lepanto was a catharsis, a proof that the enemy could be beaten. More concretely, the battle marked the definitive end of an era. It was the last great clash of oar-powered galleys in the Mediterranean, the final, thunderous act in the century-long drama that began with the fall of the fortress. While the Ottoman navy remained a powerful force, its aura of inevitable dominance was gone. The initiative, though not outright control, began to slowly shift. The battle also solidified the importance of heavy naval artillery and robust, sail-powered ships over the agile but vulnerable galley. The future of naval power, as Spain's Atlantic exploits were already demonstrating, lay not in the confined waters of the inland sea, but on the global ocean. Lepanto was therefore both an end and a beginning. It closed the book on the naval world order defined by the fall of Constantinople, while simultaneously pointing toward the new age of gunnery and global empire that would dominate the centuries to come. The fall of the fortress delivered a lesson in military strategy so profound that it would echo for centuries, fundamentally rewriting the rules of naval engagement. The Ottomans achieved their stunning victory not through a superior fleet in a traditional battle, but by refusing to play by the established rules altogether. Their decision to drag ships over a hill was a masterclass in what modern strategists would call asymmetric warfare. It demonstrated that the greatest strength of a fixed defense is also its most exploitable weakness, its immobility. For generations, naval power had been conceptualized as a series of strong points on a map. Control the key harbors and straits, and you control the sea. The events at the Golden Horn shattered this centuries-old assumption, proving that true command of the maritime domain is not about holding territory, but about controlling the movement upon it. The ability to appear where you are least expected, to strike from an unforeseen direction, became the new hallmark of a dominant navy. This pivotal moment accelerated a strategic evolution from a defensive to an offensive mindset. The old model, perfected by the Byzantines, was inherently reactive. It waited for an enemy to come to it, confident that its walls and chains would prevail. The Ottoman model was the complete opposite, proactive, unpredictable, and relentlessly offensive. They seized the initiative and forced their enemy to react to their moves, a psychological advantage as powerful as any physical weapon. This shift redefined the very concept of command of the sea. It was no longer a static condition achieved by possessing fortified bases. It became a dynamic state of freedom, the freedom to move your forces wherever you wished while denying that same freedom to your opponent. This principle of fleet mobility and strategic initiative would become the central tenet for every great naval power that followed, from the sailing fleets of the age of exploration to the carrier battle groups of the 20th century. The lesson was absorbed with particular urgency by the rising Atlantic powers. Observing the fate of the static Byzantine defense, nations like Spain, Portugal, and later England and the Netherlands understood that their future security and prosperity depended on navies built for open ocean operations, not for coastal defense. They began investing in vessels that were not tied to friendly shorelines, sturdy, ocean-going carracks and galleons that could project power across thousands of miles of open water. This was the birth of the concept of a blue water navy, a force designed to seek out and destroy an enemy's fleet far from home, rather than waiting for them to attack a fortified harbor. The focus of naval architecture shifted from creating ships that supported land-based fortifications to creating ships that were, in themselves, floating fortresses capable of independent action for months at a time. This new philosophy also demanded a revolution in command and control. The captain of a galley in the confined waters of the Mediterranean could often see his entire fleet and receive visual signals from his admiral. But the captain of a galleon in the vastness of the Atlantic had to exercise a great deal of personal initiative. This necessitated a more professional officer corps, men trained not just in seamanship but in independent strategic thinking. Naval academies began to emerge, and the study of maritime strategy became a formal discipline. Theorists like Alfred Thayer Mahan, writing centuries later, would trace the roots of modern naval doctrine back to this fundamental shift in thinking, arguing that the key to national greatness lay in controlling sea lanes through a powerful, mobile fleet capable of offensive action, a principle demonstrated with breathtaking clarity when the Ottomans turned a mountain into a ramp for ships. The legacy of this strategic insight is visible even today. The failure of fixed defensive systems, from the Maginot Line in the Second World War to static missile silos in the Cold War, repeatedly underscores the same lesson, that a strategy based purely on fortification is vulnerable to an enemy who chooses to bypass it. In the digital age, the principle of flexibility over fortification is more relevant than ever. Cybersecurity, for instance, is no longer just about building higher digital walls. It's about creating resilient systems that can detect, adapt, and respond to threats from any direction, much like a modern navy patrols vast areas rather than guarding a single port. The most enduring legacy of the fortress's fall was not a specific tactic, but a timeless truth about the nature of conflict itself, that in the eternal contest between the shield and the spear, the greatest advantage will always lie with the side that is willing to rethink the very nature of the spear. The stunning success of the Ottoman strategy sent a shockwave through the halls of military engineers across Europe, forcing a complete and fundamental re-evaluation of what a fortress was supposed to be. For centuries, the guiding principle had been verticality and sheer mass build walls as high and as thick as possible to overwhelm any attacker. But the sight of warships being dragged over a hill proved that an enemy would not always obligingly attack your strongest point. The very concept of a front and a back to a fortification was now dangerously obsolete. The lesson was brutally clear. A fortress that could only face one way was a fortress that could be defeated from its blind spot. This realization sparked a revolution in military architecture, a shift in thinking so profound that its geometric fingerprints would soon be visible on coastlines across the globe. This new philosophy gave birth to a distinctly low-slung and angular style of fortress known as the Trace Italian, or the Star Fort. If you were to look down on one from above, it would no longer resemble a simple square or rectangle with towers at the corners. Instead, you would see a complex star-shaped pattern of points and recesses. This radical design was a direct response to the threat that had doomed the fortress of the Golden Horn. The star shape was all about eliminating blind spots. Each projecting point, known as a bastion, was designed to provide a clear line of fire along the face of the adjacent bastion. This created a deadly, interlocking web of defensive fire. If an enemy army tried to approach the walls, they would find themselves caught in a crossfire from at least two different directions, with no safe place to shelter. The fortress itself became a weapon, its very shape dictating a killing field. But the innovations were not just about angles. The new fortresses also embraced the power of earth. Engineers realized that high stone walls were magnificent targets for the new, powerful cannons that had also proven their worth at Constantinople. The solution was to build lower, thicker walls that were often backed by massive earthen ramparts. This earth absorbed the impact of cannonballs far more effectively than rigid stone, which would shatter and send deadly fragments flying. The profile of these forts became squat and menacing, hugging the landscape rather than towering over it. Ditches, moats, and outlying earthworks, known as ravelins and hornworks, were added to create layered defensive zones, forcing an attacker to overcome obstacle after obstacle before even reaching the main walls. The focus was no longer on creating a single, impenetrable barrier, but on constructing a deep, resilient system that could absorb and disrupt an attack from any compass point. This new defensive doctrine quickly spread from the drafting tables of Italian engineers like Michele Sanmicheli to the front lines of the Ottoman Christian conflict. The island of Malta became a living textbook of this new architecture. After a devastating Ottoman siege in 1565, the Knights Hospitaller, now known as the Knights of Malta, undertook a monumental building program. They fortified their new home not with a single great castle, but with an entire network of star-shaped fortresses like Fort St. Elmo and Fort St. Angelo, each positioned to provide supporting fire for the others. The city of Valletta itself was designed as a fortified city from the ground up, its streets laid out in a grid to allow for the rapid movement of troops to any threatened point on its massive, angled walls. The lesson of the Golden Horn had been learned. A single strongpoint could fall, but a mutually supporting system of defenses could hold indefinitely. The influence of this architectural revolution did not stop at the Mediterranean coastline. As European powers expanded their empires across the Atlantic, they carried these new principles with them. In the Caribbean, where Spanish treasure fleets were the target of pirates and rival navies, cities like Havana in Cuba and San Juan in Puerto Rico were transformed into veritable fortresses of the New World. The massive fortifications of El Morro and San Cristobal in San Juan are perfect examples of the trace Italian adapted to a new environment. Their low, sprawling, star-shaped designs command the entrance to the harbor, their cannons covering every possible approach from the sea. Similarly, the fortifications of Cartagena in present-day Colombia were a masterwork of layered, all-round defense designed to repel attacks from the land or the sea. For over 300 years, this architectural language of points, angles, and overlapping fields of fire became the universal signature of imperial power, a constant reminder that the world of defense had been permanently reshaped by the day a sultan decided to move his navy over a hill instead of through a chain. Yet from the ashes of conquest and the turmoil of war emerged one of history's great ironies, a profound and largely unintended exchange of knowledge that would reshape the Western world. The violent fall of Constantinople, while a catastrophe for the Byzantine Empire, acted as a powerful catalyst, scattering its most precious human treasures across Europe. As the Ottoman armies secured the city, a flood of refugees sought escape, and among them were some of the finest scholars, artists, and theologians of the age. These were the guardians of a profound intellectual tradition, carrying with them not just their personal belongings, but something far more valuable: precious manuscripts containing the literary, philosophical, and scientific works of ancient Greece and Rome. For centuries, these texts had been preserved and studied within the Byzantine world, but they were largely unknown or inaccessible in Western Europe. The arrival of these scholars in Italy, particularly in cities like Florence, Venice, and Rome, was like a sudden rain on parched soil. They brought with them a knowledge of classical Greek that had been largely lost in the West, and they carried copies of foundational texts by thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, Homer, and Archimedes that had been mere legends in European libraries. This influx of people and parchment provided the essential fuel for the intellectual fire that was already beginning to smolder in Italy, the movement we now call the Renaissance or rebirth. Italian humanists, who are already seeking to reconnect with the wisdom of the ancient world, eagerly welcomed these Byzantine immigrés. They hired them as teachers to instruct a new generation in the subtleties of the Greek language and the complexities of Platonic philosophy. The most famous example is perhaps the scholar Gemistus Pletho, whose lectures in Florence ignited a passionate interest in Plato that rivaled the dominant Aristotelianism of the medieval church. This direct access to original Greek sources, unmediated by sometimes flawed Latin translations, allowed European thinkers to engage with classical ideas in a Chinese letter, more authentic way. It wasn't just about recovering old books, it was about recovering a whole way of thinking that emphasized human potential, rational inquiry, and the beauty of the natural world. The fall of a single fortress intended to cement Ottoman power had inadvertently unlocked the intellectual vault that helped Europe rediscover its own classical roots, setting the stage for a cultural transformation that would redefine art, science, and philosophy for centuries to come. This exchange was not confined to the quiet halls of universities and princely courts. It was also a constant, gritty reality on the decks of ships and in the bustling ports of the Mediterranean. The century of conflict and coexistence between Ottoman and European sailors, though often hostile, created a relentless and practical dialogue of technology and technique. When Venetian and Ottoman galleys clashed in battle or cautiously traded in peacetime, their crews were constantly observing one another. They noted the design of each other's hulls, the cut of their sails, and the placement of their rudders. Captains exchanged knowledge about winds, currents, and hidden shoals, often through the intermediary of multilingual sailors or prisoners of war. This was a school of hard knocks, where a better way to rig a sail or a more accurate chart of a dangerous coastline could mean the difference between profit and loss, or even life and death. The Ottomans, having absorbed the maritime expertise of Greek and Arab sailors, possessed sophisticated knowledge of Eastern Mediterranean waters, while the Europeans, particularly the Italians, were masters of shipbuilding and navigation in the Western Basin. This constant interaction forced a rapid cross-pollination of the best ideas from both sides. The field of cartography, the science of map-making, advanced dramatically as a direct result of this cultural collision. The Ottoman Empire, now controlling the vital crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, became a clearinghouse for geographic knowledge. Ottoman admirals like Piri Reis compiled detailed portolan charts, navigational maps filled with intricate coastlines and compass roses that synthesized information from Arab, Spanish, and Portuguese sources, including maps that may have hinted at the New World. While these maps were state secrets, their existence and rumored accuracy pushed European cartographers to improve their own work. The competition for control of the sea lanes made accurate navigation a strategic imperative, fueling an arms race in map-making that benefited all parties involved, however reluctantly. Similarly, the design of ships themselves evolved through this exchange. European shipwrights began to incorporate design elements from the sturdy Ottoman merchant vessels that plied the rough waters of the Black Sea, while Ottoman naval architects adapted features from the high-sided, cannon-heavy galleons being developed in the Atlantic to counter them. This was not a formal technology transfer. but a slow, osmotic process of adaptation driven by the harsh demands of survival and competition on the open water. Perhaps the most significant technological transfer occurred in the realm of armaments. The massive bronze cannons that had shattered the walls of Constantinople were a terrifying revelation to European powers. The Ottomans had mastered the art of siege artillery, and their foundries were among the most advanced in the world. The need to counter this Ottoman advantage provided a powerful incentive for European monarchs to invest heavily in their own gunpowder technology. They actively recruited skilled metalworkers, sometimes even from Ottoman territories, to improve their casting techniques. This rivalry accelerated the development of more mobile, reliable, and powerful cannons across Europe. The knowledge of gunpowder and its military applications, which had originally traveled westward from China through the Islamic world, was now being refined and intensified through the crucible of Ottoman-European conflict. The very weapons that had secured an Ottoman victory became a key catalyst for a military revolution in the West that would eventually eclipse its teacher. This dynamic illustrates the paradoxical nature of the exchange. The pressure applied by a dominant Ottoman navy ultimately spurred the technological innovations that would, in the long run, contribute to its decline. The flow of knowledge, once begun, could not be contained by chains or fortresses, and it flowed in both directions, reshaping all it touched in a complex dance of conflict and connection. The century that unfolded after the fortress fell did not merely change the balance of power. It closed an entire volume of history and opened a new one. The Mediterranean Sea, for over 1,000 years the central stage of the Roman world, was fundamentally transformed in its very identity. Before 1453, you could still, in a symbolic sense, call it a Roman lake. The Byzantine Empire, though shrunken, was the direct heir to Rome, and its navy, symbolized by that unbreachable chain, enforced a certain order. The sea was a contested frontier, to be sure, with Islamic powers controlling the southern shore, but it was a familiar contest, a centuries-old stalemate with established rules and recognized boundaries. The fall of the fortress shattered that entire framework. In its place emerged a new reality. The Mediterranean became, for the next 100 years, an Ottoman sphere of influence. This was not an absolute domination, but a decisive shift in the center of gravity. The Ottoman Empire now controlled the vital center: the Bosporus, the Aegean Sea, the coasts of Greece and Anatolia. From their magnificent new capital in Istanbul, the sultans could project power outward in every direction. Christian Europe was no longer facing an adversary on the other side of a frontier. It was now encircling a powerful Ottoman core, forced onto the defensive. The great maritime republics of Venice and Genoa, which had once treated the sea as their commercial backyard, found themselves reduced to managing a precarious perimeter, desperately holding onto a string of island fortresses and coastal outposts like Crete and Cyprus. They became reactive powers, their fleets constantly scrambling to respond to Ottoman initiatives rather than setting the agenda themselves. The psychological map had been redrawn as decisively as the political one. A pervasive sense of vulnerability replaced the old confidence. This transformation touched every aspect of life. Economically, the old trade routes that had fueled the Italian Renaissance were now subject to Ottoman control and taxation. The predictable flow of goods from east to west was replaced by a tense, often interrupted commerce, where a Venetian merchant's fortune could be wiped out by a sudden decree from Istanbul. Militarily, the nature of conflict changed. The era of great crusading armies marching to the Holy Land was over, replaced by a relentless, grinding naval struggle characterized by raids, blockades, and sieges of fortified islands. The knight on horseback, the iconic figure of the medieval age, was increasingly overshadowed by the Ottoman Janissary and the Christian marine, their battles fought on the rolling decks of galleys rather than the fields of France. Most profoundly, the event signaled the definitive close of the medieval period and the uncertain dawn of the early modern world. The Mediterranean, which had been the undisputed center of the Western world since the time of Alexander the Great, began to lose its primacy. The very success of the Ottoman Empire in dominating the inland sea had an unintended consequence. It pushed the ambitious kingdoms on Europe's Atlantic seaboard to look elsewhere for their fortunes. Why fight for every inch of a contested sea when vast, uncharted oceans offered a path to bypass the Ottoman monopoly entirely? The focus of world history began its slow but inexorable pivot westward. The investments in shipbuilding and navigation, spurred by the Ottoman threat, were now turned toward the Atlantic, the caravels and galleons that would carry Spain and Portugal to global empire were, in part, a strategic response to the new reality in the Mediterranean. In this way, the fall of a single fortress did not just reshape the Mediterranean. It helped catalyze the creation of the modern world, the old, introverted world of the inland sea, with its ancient rivalries and delicate balances, gave way to an outward-looking age of global exploration and transoceanic empire. The Mediterranean became a secondary theater, its fate increasingly influenced by powers whose centers of gravity lay far beyond its shores. The century of Ottoman dominance was, paradoxically, the century that witnessed the Mediterranean's descent from the center of the world to a region whose destiny would be decided by empires born on the Atlantic waves. The old order was gone, and the new one was a world away. But what if that chain had never been broken? What if, on that fateful night, the Ottoman plan had been discovered, or a sudden storm had drenched the greased logs, halting the impossible portage in its tracks? It is a captivating exercise to step away from the history we know and peer into the world that might have been, a world where the fortress of the Golden Horn continued to stand sentinel. The survival of this single bastion would have sent ripples of change across the globe, potentially creating a timeline so different from our own that it challenges our very understanding of modern history. Let's explore the most profound possibilities, starting with the immediate fate of the Byzantine Empire. Had the fortress held, the siege of Constantinople in 1453 would almost certainly have failed. A frustrated and financially strained Sultan Mehmed might have been forced to withdraw his massive army, at least for a time. The Byzantine Empire, though reduced to little more than its capital city and a few scattered outposts, would have been granted a crucial reprieve. It would have persisted as a rump state, a living relic of Rome clinging to life, but its continued existence would have fundamentally altered the religious and political dynamics of Eastern Europe. As the last independent Orthodox Christian power, it would have remained a powerful symbolic beacon and a potential ally for the rising powers of Moscow, who were already beginning to dream of their city as the Third Rome. This could have fostered a very different relationship between the Slavic world and Western Europe, perhaps creating a stronger, more unified Christian front in the Balkans and slowing the southward expansion of powers like Hungary and Poland. The entire complex tapestry of ethnic and religious identities in that volatile region would have been woven from a different set of threads. The implications for the Ottoman Empire itself would have been equally dramatic. A failed siege would have been a massive blow to the prestige of the young Sultan Mehmed II. It could have sparked internal rebellions or challenges from rival factions within the Ottoman court, potentially delaying their consolidation of power for decades. The relentless drive westward, which in our timeline saw the Ottomans conquer the Balkans and threaten the gates of Vienna, might have been blunted or redirected. Instead of focusing on Europe, a stymied Ottoman state might have turned its ambitions eastward, toward rival Turkish principalities in Anatolia or the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and the Levant much sooner. This shift in focus could have created a powerful Islamic bloc dominating the Middle East, potentially changing the dynamics of the later conflicts with the Persian Safavid Empire and altering the balance of power in the Islamic world for centuries. The pressure that defined European foreign policy for 100 years would have been applied elsewhere, leaving the kingdoms of Central Europe to develop without the constant existential threat from the southeast. Perhaps the most far-reaching change of all involves the spark that ignited the age of exploration. The primary motivation for Portuguese and Spanish voyages was the desperate need to bypass the Ottoman stranglehold on the traditional land and sea routes to the spices and silks of Asia. If the fortress had held and the Byzantine Empire had survived, the flow of goods through the Bosporus might have continued, albeit in a diminished and more precarious form. The Italian maritime republics, Venice and Genoa, would have retained a stronger foothold in the eastern Mediterranean. Without the urgent, existential crisis created by the Ottoman monopoly, would the kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula have felt the same burning need to gamble their fortunes on dangerous voyages into the unknown Atlantic? The enterprise of Prince Henry the Navigator in Portugal was a direct response to the changing geopolitical landscape. Without the same level of pressure, his efforts might have remained a minor, scholarly pursuit rather than a national crusade. Christopher Columbus might never have found a patron willing to fund his audacious plan to sail west. The discovery of the Americas, an event that reshaped the global distribution of wealth, power, and disease, could have been delayed by a century or more, or perhaps undertaken by an entirely different civilization. The entire demographic and cultural map of the world, from the languages spoken in the Americas to the trade networks of the Indian Ocean, would be unrecognizable. This single point of failure, this one fortress, proves to be a stunning example of the butterfly effect in history, where a small change in initial conditions leads to vastly different outcomes. The world we inhabit today, with its specific borders, its dominant languages, its religious distributions, and even the foods on our tables shaped by the Columbian Exchange, is in many ways a product of that day in 1453. To imagine the fortress holding is to imagine a parallel Earth, one where the center of gravity might have remained in the Mediterranean, where the Americas remained undiscovered by Europe for generations longer, and where the tensions that defined the early modern period played out along entirely different fault lines. It is a powerful reminder that history is not a predetermined march, but a delicate web of contingencies where the courage of a few defenders, the success of a single audacious plan, or even the whims of the weather can alter the destiny of centuries. Today, if you were to walk the grounds where the fortress of the Golden Horn once stood, you would encounter a landscape of quiet contemplation. The massive stones that defied armies have been weathered by centuries of sun and rain, their sharp edges softened by time. What was once a scene of thunderous cannon fire and clashing steel is now a place where visitors stroll and reflect. Yet the silence of these ruins is profoundly loud with meaning. They stand as a permanent monument to a single, shattering truth, that no power, no matter how seemingly eternal, is immune to the relentless march of change. The fortress is no longer just a collection of broken walls. It has been transformed into a powerful symbol, and its meaning shifts dramatically depending on who is telling the story. For the Turkish people, the story of the fortress is a foundational epic of national identity, a testament to brilliant strategy and unwavering determination. It is remembered not merely as a military target that was captured, but as the critical puzzle piece in the conquest of Constantinople, an event that Turks know as the Fethi, or the Conquest. In this narrative, the fortress is a symbol of ingenuity, the moment their ancestors looked at an impossible problem and devised a breathtakingly audacious solution. The image of ships being dragged overland is not just a tactical maneuver, it is a metaphor for the triumph of creative thinking over brute force, of flexibility over rigid tradition. Each year, the anniversary of the conquest is celebrated with great pride, and the story of the fortress is central to that commemoration. It represents the moment a rising power seized its destiny, transforming the Ottoman Beylik into a world empire. The stones of the fortress, in this light, are not ruins of defeat but the foundation stones of a modern nation, a permanent reminder of a glorious triumph that echoes through the centuries. But just across the Aegean Sea, the same stones tell a completely different, deeply sorrowful story. For the Greek people and for the wider Orthodox Christian world, the fall of the fortress is inextricably linked with the tragic loss of Constantinople, the Queen of Cities. It is remembered as the moment the final shield was broken, leading directly to the end of the Roman Empire after more than 1,000 years. The fortress is a site of mourning, a symbol of the Ialosi, the fall. It represents not ingenuity but catastrophe, not triumph but a profound cultural and spiritual loss. The event marked the beginning of centuries of Ottoman rule for Greek-speaking populations, a period often referred to as the Turkocratia. The memory is kept alive in folk songs, literature, and a collective sense of what was lost, not just a city, but a whole world of Byzantine art, learning, and faith. For them, the ruins are a ghost, a silent witness to a civilization that was extinguished, and a poignant reminder of the fragility of even the greatest empires. This duality makes the fortress's legacy uniquely powerful. It serves as a universal lesson in the subjectivity of history. There is no single, objective story etched into those stones. Instead, they hold two competing truths simultaneously, a testament to how the same event can be a source of immense pride for one people and a wound of deep sorrow for another. This is the nature of historical memory. It is not a fixed record but a living, breathing narrative that is shaped by identity, culture, and the passage of time. The fortress teaches us that what we choose to remember and how we choose to remember it defines our understanding of the past and our vision for the future. Beyond these national narratives, the story of the fortress has ascended to become a parable with global resonance. Its rise and fall encapsulate a cycle that has repeated itself throughout human history, the cycle of hubris and humility. The Byzantines believed their defenses were unbreachable, that their technological marvels like Greek fire and the Great Chain made them invincible. Their confidence became a weakness, blinding them to the possibility of a threat that did not play by their rules. The Ottomans, in turn, demonstrated that the greatest advantage often lies with the disruptor, the power willing to challenge conventional wisdom. Yet their own empire, which seemed so formidable after their victory, would also eventually decline, proving that no triumph is permanent. The fortress, therefore, is a symbol of the inevitable tides of geopolitics. It whispers that walls, whether made of stone or of tradition, will always be tested by the currents of new strategies, new technologies, and unyielding human ambition. It stands as a humbling reminder to every great power that the landscape of dominance is always shifting, and that today's champion can become tomorrow's memory. The story of the fortress is not just a relic of the past, it's a powerful mirror reflecting challenges we face in our own complex world. The core lesson that a seemingly unbreachable defense can be undone by an unexpected approach resonates with startling clarity far beyond the field of medieval battle. Consider the digital realm, our modern frontier. A corporation or a nation might invest fortunes in building the digital equivalent of those massive walls. A formidable firewall, the latest intrusion detection systems, complex password protocols. This is their fortress, their bastion of cybersecurity. They feel secure behind these static defenses. Yet, just as the Ottomans bypassed the chain by moving overland, a modern attacker rarely tries to smash through the front gate. Instead, they use social engineering, tricking a single employee with a cleverly disguised email into clicking a malicious link. This simple act can bypass millions of dollars worth of security infrastructure, granting access to the heart of the network. The vulnerability was not in the code of the firewall, but in the unpredictable nature of human psychology. The defense was static, designed for a direct assault, but the attack was dynamic and asymmetric, targeting the one element the architects never fully fortified: people. This principle of asymmetric thinking, of overcoming a stronger opponent by changing the rules of the game, is a cornerstone of modern strategy. In business, a small startup cannot hope to compete with an industry giant by playing the same game by trying to outspend them on marketing or outproduce them in factories. That would be like a tiny fleet challenging the Byzantine navy head-on. The successful disruptor does what Mehmed II did. They find a new pathway. They might leverage a new technology like cloud computing to achieve scale without massive capital investment. They might identify an underserved customer niche the giant has overlooked, or create a completely new business model, as streaming services did to traditional television networks. They don't try to break the chain, they find a way to go over it, rendering their competitors' greatest advantages, their market share, their brand recognition, suddenly irrelevant. The victory goes not to the one with the most resources, but to the one with the most innovative strategy. Furthermore, the fall of the fortress is a timeless lesson in systemic risk and the danger of a single point of failure. The entire Byzantine naval defense, and by extension the security of their capital, was dependent on the integrity of that one chain and the fortress that controlled it. When that single point failed, the entire system collapsed. We see parallel vulnerabilities in our own interconnected world. A modern supply chain, for instance, might be a marvel of efficiency, with components flowing from across the globe to assemble a single product. But if that supply chain relies on a single factory in one geographic location, or a single shipping route through a narrow strait, it has created a critical vulnerability. A natural disaster, a political dispute, or a pandemic can disrupt that single point, causing cascading failures that halt production worldwide. The lesson is to build resilience through redundancy and diversification, to have multiple suppliers, alternative routes, and backup plans. It's about designing systems that can absorb a shock at one point without the entire structure crumbling. Much like the star forts that replaced the fortress of the Golden Horn, were designed with multiple, mutually supporting bastions so that the fall of one did not mean the fall of all. Ultimately, the most enduring legacy of this historical event is its championing of adaptability over rigid strength. The Byzantines were masters of a system that had worked for centuries. Their failure was not a lack of courage or engineering skill, but a failure of imagination, an inability to conceive of a threat that did not conform to their historical experience. In contrast, the Ottomans embodied strategic agility. They observed, they learned, and they were willing to attempt the audacious. This is the essential mindset for navigating the 21st century, whether in national security, corporate leadership, or personal career planning. The world is changing at an unprecedented pace, and the strategies that brought success yesterday may lead to obsolescence tomorrow. The goal is not to build a perfect, static defense against change, but to cultivate a culture of continuous learning, innovation, and flexibility. The fortress that fell teaches us that true security lies not in the thickness of our walls, but in the agility of our minds and our willingness to rethink our assumptions before the world does it for us. So as the dust settled on the broken walls of the fortress and the echoes of battle faded, the true magnitude of what had occurred began to reveal itself. This was not merely the conclusion of a siege, it was the closing of one historical epoch and the violent, abrupt opening of another. The fall of the fortress of the Golden Horn stands as one of those rare hinge moments in history, an event where the trajectory of human civilization pivots dramatically. It demonstrates with stunning clarity that the most profound changes are not always slow evolutions, but can be triggered by a single, concentrated point of failure. The fortress was that point, the linchpin in a complex system of power, trade, and culture. When it gave way, the entire structure it supported came crashing down, setting in motion a chain of consequences that would ripple outward for 100 years and beyond, reshaping the map of the world in ways its defenders and conquerors could never have fully imagined. The most immediate and visible consequence was the dramatic shift in the balance of power. The ancient Byzantine Empire, the direct heir to Rome that had endured for over 1,000 years, was extinguished almost overnight. In its place rose the Ottoman Empire, not just as a land power but as the new, undisputed master of the Mediterranean Sea. This was not a simple changing of the guard. It represented a fundamental reorientation of the world's center of gravity from the old Roman heartland to a new, dynamic power centered on the Bosporus. For the next century, the Ottoman navy would dictate terms in the inland sea, challenging the great maritime republics, raiding the coasts of Italy and Spain, and forcing the kingdoms of Europe into a defensive posture they had not known for centuries. The confident, commerce-filled Mediterranean of the Italian Renaissance gave way to a contested, fearful sea, where the sight of an Ottoman sail on the horizon could spell doom for a coastal village. The event proved that empires are not fated to endure. They are delicate constructions that can be undone with a single, well-placed blow. Yet the story does not end with the rise of one empire and the fall of another. The most fascinating part of this historical drama is the chain reaction it set off. The Ottoman dominance of the traditional trade routes through the Bosporus created an existential crisis for the commercial powers of Europe, particularly Venice and Genoa. Their wealth, built on being the middlemen between East and West, was suddenly under threat. This economic pressure, more than any abstract spirit of adventure, was the primary catalyst for the age of exploration. It pushed navigators and monarchs to look for alternatives, to gamble on the terrifying vastness of the Atlantic Ocean in the hope of finding a new way to the riches of the East. The voyages of Da Gama, Columbus, and Magellan were, in a very real sense, a direct response to the fall of that one fortress. In trying to circumvent the Ottoman world, Europe accidentally stumbled upon the Americas, unlocking wealth and resources on a scale that would ultimately shift the global center of power from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, paving the way for the modern era. The conquest intended to consolidate power in one sea ultimately pushed European ambition out into the entire world. The legacy of this event is not confined to the history books. It offers timeless lessons about the nature of strategy, defense, and innovation. The Ottomans won not because they had a bigger or better navy in a straight fight, but because they employed asymmetric thinking. They refused to accept the constraints of the battlefield as defined by their enemy. While the Byzantines invested everything in a perfect static defense, the Ottomans valued mobility and surprise. This lesson, that adaptability and ingenuity will almost always triumph over rigid strength, resonates powerfully today. We see it in the business world, where agile startups disrupt industry giants by changing the rules of the game. We see it in cybersecurity, where a single clever phishing email can bypass millions of dollars worth of firewall protection. And we see it in our own lives, where the ability to adapt to unexpected challenges is often the key to success. The fortress teaches us that the greatest vulnerability is often overconfidence in our own defenses and a failure to imagine that the threat might come from an entirely new direction. Therefore, the story of the Fortress of the Golden Horn is more than a tale of medieval conflict. It is a profound reminder of the fragility of power and the enduring force of human ingenuity. It shows us that history is not a predetermined march but a web of interconnected events, where a single decision, a single invention, or a single breach in a wall can alter the destiny of continents. The echoes of its fall are a humbling message to every great power, that no wall, no matter how thick, and no tradition, no matter how venerable, can guarantee permanence in the face of change. The true legacy of that day is the understanding that our world is shaped not by immutable forces, but by the constant interplay of strategy, chance, and the relentless human drive to overcome the